as the legend currently stands, it is the phoenix that is the mythical creature which is supposed to rise from the ashes to a glorious new existence. But in the South African winelands, it is the eagle that has been brought back to life. Of course, I'm talking about Constantia's rather famous wine estate, Eagle's Nest, which used to be famous for its Merlots and its Viogniers and its amazing Syrahs. But then at one point it got sold off and got bought by a German businessman who was unsure as to whether he wanted to continue producing wine. But thankfully, common sense reigned and the Eagle's Nest wine range received a new lease on life. To understand why this is such exciting news, you actually have to understand the place of Eagle's Nest, which is why in today's Hand Drink Solo Curious Wine of the Day, we are not only going to talk about the incredible Eagle's Nest Reserve Sauvignon Blanc, but we're also going to focus in detail on the wild, high-altitude, otherworldly vineyard sites that make this wine possible. Eagle's Nest is located in the small but enormously historic standalone wine ward of Constantia, right down on the southern tip of the African continent. It's tucked away in the foothills, kind of between Table Mountain and the Constantia Berg. And really, in its previous iteration, the name Eagle's Nest would have made very little sense to anyone who visited it, because you would come off the main road in Constantia and drive up maybe 30 or 40 meters up a small hill, and there you would enjoy a really picturesque wine tasting experience on a green meadow with lovely blankets and a bubbling brook. But to be honest, there was absolutely nothing eagerly or nesty about it. And that was because to really understand the true magic of Eagle's Nest, you couldn't sit on a grassy meadow at 80 or 100 meters above sea level, but instead had to climb, sometimes literally through the clouds, in order to reach the real Eagle's Nest, which sits at between 300 and 400 meters above sea level, in what is arguably some of the most spectacular vineyards in all of the Cape Winelands. When you are at the very peak of the Eagle's Nest property, you're sitting at almost 400 meters above sea level. You're surrounded by really rather cool ocean on at least 3 of your 4 sides. And I can personally testify that even in the middle of summer, you will most likely need some sort of protective windbreaker because there are these crazy icy winds coming at you from every direction, not least of all because the vineyards have direct line of sight to the icy ocean in False Bay. As we mentioned earlier, Eagle's Nest did exist in a previous iteration where it had its reserve range, but it also had a number of slightly more affordable entry-level blends. And this was really to allow the consumer to get a taste of the Eagle's Nest experience without having an exorbitant price tag. But the new strategic team realized very quickly that to be able to farm these crazy terraced vineyards, it really makes absolutely no economic sense whatsoever to produce any sort of entry-level products. This is why Eagle's Nest are trimming down their wine range significantly. Another reason is because they began to ask themselves not what can Eagle's Nest grow, but rather what can Eagle's Nest grow that will compete with the best in the category. So they've spent really rather a long time doing research, consulting viticulturalists and soil experts and agricultural experts just to figure out how to do this job properly. And it became obvious that they could grow a number of cultivars at a fairly high level of quality, but their focus really zoomed in on Syrah and Sauvignon Blanc, mostly because these 2 cultivars made them quite confident that they could produce wines that compete amongst the best in the world. Now, some of you who have known Eagle's Nest for a little bit longer may be panicking and pulling your hair out and going, what about these award-winning Merlots and Viogniers? Well, the good news in the short run is that those wines are still in circulation and you can get hold of them, but you should know the future of the estate is narrowing ever more so onto Sauvignon Blanc and Syrah. And that is the long-term goal, is to focus on just those 2 wines and produce them in small quantities at the very highest quality that they possibly can. In order to achieve this long-term goal, they've been planting some super crazy, marginal, very daring vineyard sites, and it's enormously exciting because if there's any vineyard that has the potential to become globally iconic purely because of what it's like to stand in that space, this surely is it. Then again, it's all good and well me telling you how crazy the vineyards are and how high they are or how pretty they are, but that doesn't make it good in the glass. So let's get into the wine and see what winemaker Craig Barnard has prepared for us. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, we do get a fairly multifaceted nose, which in many senses is quite a skill, because Sauvignon Blanc, while being an aromatic legend, is also a cultivar that expresses its site quite clearly. So in South Africa, if you're getting Sauvignon Blanc from very cool vineyards in coastal sites, you get a lot more herbaceous, slightly vegetal, sometimes saline elements, which can be glorious, although they certainly aren't for everyone. And then if you grow it inland, perhaps in a hotter vineyard, you might get pineapple and peach and beautifully generous fruit, but none of the acidity that you hope for. Again, because it is so clearly expressing that particular site. So perhaps then it shouldn't be surprising that, not unlike the actual vineyard site itself, one does get a little bit of everything. So there is a lovely touch of lemongrass, kiwi fruit, and then black currant leaf, which is certainly not taken for granted in Sauvignon Blancs from South Africa. And then there's also slightly sweeter, perhaps white peach notes. Underneath it all, there's a superbly subtle hint of nutmeg, a kind of oak spice to it. And that makes sense because at least 2/3 of this wine is barrel fermented in 500-liter barrels. When we give this guy a sip, well, it really is quite beautifully concentrated. There's a sense of weight to the wine. And this is not always what you'd expect from a Sauvignon Blanc, but there's definitely a sense of power. And perhaps what's interesting is that the fruit really does speak far more obviously or far more loudly than any sort of oak influence, despite being 2/3 barrel fermented. And I think this really is testament to those crazy low yield, high altitude, terraced, steep, quite marginal vineyards that produce the fruit for this wine. And then towards the finish, you get a slightly pithy citrus end, but in the mid palate, especially as it warms in your mouth, you get a beautiful mix of riper citrus and that stone fruit that we mentioned. And then I did kind of bury the headline in the sense that this beautiful acidity, which actually, I know you might have noticed my eyes watering earlier on, it's just so present in the wine, and at the very top end, it kind of leans over into perhaps a white grapefruit, but then at the bottom end, as we mentioned, and especially as it warms in your mouth, a little bit of that sweeter white peach. And alongside that on the nose, there's a kind of green, tangy kiwi fruit element, which is just glorious. It's really a very multifaceted wine. And I guess that should completely make sense, because when you're grown in this super high terraced vineyard that faces directly towards some really rather warm African sun, but you also have these icy cold ocean breezes blowing over you all the time. As a vine, it's no surprise that you manage to pick up a whole range of influences and express such a dynamic wine, because it has all the generous fruit and concentration that you might get from a warmer expression, along with the beautiful, elegant acidity that you might get from a cooler coastal expression. That's all we have time for today, but I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos on more Constantia wines and why they are focusing so tightly on Sauvignon Blanc. And until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.